The Auschwitz concentration camp saw some of the most brutal actions of the entire Second World War. Prisoners who were forcibly transported there were in constant danger of being sent to the gas chambers or simply executed at the whim of the SS guards. Members of this organization were selected for their fanaticism and lack of mercy towards peoples marked as enemies of the Reich. But even the crimes of many of these men cannot compare with the atrocities committed by Hauptscharführer Gerhard Palitzsch. In the years he was active in the camp, he was the executioner of hundreds, perhaps even thousands of prisoners, and never lost his composure. Testimonies abound about how he enjoyed torturing and killing, even being known to smile placidly while doing so. Many of his victims, chillingly, were children. From summary executions to shooting infants, to smashing babies' heads in front of their mothers, nothing seemed too cruel for this sadistic officer. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Gerhard Palitzsch, the infanticide of Auschwitz.
A young child ran after the border, but suddenly SS who was guarding there, they had bayonets on there, and they went with this, ran after the child. And he caught the child, he tore out the bottle of water, threw it away, and he toasted the child in the sky and picked it up on his bayonet.
There are countless sources that speak of the cruelty of the Nazis in charge of the concentration camps. But rarely are there so many cases of brutality committed specifically against children, as in the story of Gerhard Palitzsch. What the witnesses tell chills the blood, even of those accustomed to reading about what happened in these places. But before we delve into this dark aspect of his personality, let's get to know better who this individual was. Palitzsch's military career began almost at the same time as the arrival of the National Socialist Party to power in Germany in 1933. A faithful member of the SS, his first jobs were as a sentry in the original concentration camps built by the Nazis at just 20 years old. Contrary to what many might think, these places were already in German territory long before the beginning of the Second World War. They were generally used to house common criminals and political prisoners, since their construction was prior to Hitler's extermination campaigns. Palitzsch spent time in the Lichtenberg and Sachsenburg camps before being transferred to Sachsenhausen in 1936. This detention center held homosexuals, gypsies, and Jehovah's Witnesses, among others, before Jews and Soviet prisoners of war were forcibly transported. It is known for having had a scientific experimentation area, where studies were carried out to find the most effective way to commit the mass murders that Hitler was planning.
Early on, it happened with prisoners being placed in a small room. Often music would be playing, and then the prisoners were told they would have their height and weight measured in a fake medical facility, before they were then shot and executed through the back of the neck, via a pistol shoved through a sliding door behind their neck. This was considered too time-consuming, and the SS even trialled executing more prisoners by forcing them to dig pits, and they were then shot in them. Also, they used these mass graves following hangings, but these methods also caused too much panic within the prisoner population, so the SS had to come up with something more discreet and quiet.
Furthermore, other experiments were conducted, aiming to create a drug that would enhance the abilities and endurance of German soldiers, always using prisoners as guinea pigs. These trials resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people. Added to those sent to the gas chamber, Sachsenhausen became the grave of tens of thousands of enemies of the Reich. But even before this, Germans were already committing abuses against those held there. By 1936, Palitzsch had been promoted to Blockführer, or block leader. He was in charge of one of the numerous barracks for prisoners at the site, where he could put into practice the cruelty that would characterize him in the following years. His tasks in this position included taking attendance of the inmates, supervising them during forced labor, and assigning their daily rations. Anyone who offended Palitzsch, real or imagined, risked going without food for the day. His lack of empathy in managing prisoners soon led to another promotion, this time to Rapportführer. Now, Palitzsch commanded groups of block leaders. However, he continued to oversee the discipline of the captives, often making them stand for hours while he took roll call. Weakened by lack of food and endless work, this experience was overwhelming for the detainees. They had to stand firm despite cold, rain, or snow, or risk the guard deciding to start the whole process over from scratch. Beyond his dealings with the detainees, the Rapportführer was also responsible for training new camp personnel, teaching them the brutality that was sought. Only the cruelest Nazis, like Palitzsch, were trusted with this task. But any acts he may have committed pale in comparison to what he would do years later. In May 1940, with the Second World War underway, he was transferred to the most infamous of all German concentration camps, Auschwitz. This place stands as the most terrible of all centers where the Germans conducted their elimination campaigns. Palitzsch was no minor figure in this. Supported by his party, he was able to unleash the brutality that defined him. According to survivor testimonies, he used to deliver a speech to newcomers that made his lack of humanity clear. "We Germans have no mercy for enemies of the Third Reich like you. With joy we will pursue you to the chimneys of the crematoriums. Forget your wives, your children, your family. Here you will die like dogs."
On one occasion, Palitzsch shot several Polish officers who had reached the camp with a transport in August 1940. The reason for their killing was their refusal to kiss his boots. Palitzsch was a twisted sadist who enjoyed torturing his victims before killing them. He would whip the poor prisoners with 10 to 25 strokes and then chase them in the frog position for a 500-meter distance to the bunker, where they would wait for the execution for a few hours while being harassed and tortured throughout that time.
When Palitzsch moved there, he did so with 30 German prisoners. These were not those considered racially inferior by the government, but rather criminals and convicts. They had been personally selected by Palitzsch to work as supervisors in front of the rest of the captives. They were known as kapos, and although they shared confinement with the others, they were treated better by the Nazis. They also had the authority to severely punish their fellow inmates, whether through beatings, food deprivation, or false accusations of conspiracy against the party. They frequently abused the power they held and could be even crueler than the guards themselves. Their tasks were brutal, and Palitzsch, the most sadistic of all, ensured through them a regime of terror in the camp. One of the most macabre features of Auschwitz was the yard located between blocks 10 and 11. There stood the death wall, the wall where, from late 1941 onwards, tens of thousands of prisoners were summarily executed. Many were Polish or Soviet soldiers and officers, murdered under the pretext of committing crimes against the regime. But many civilians, who had never raised arms against any German, also met their end at this wall. Any action deemed offensive by a camp guard could lead to more victims being added to the wall. Gerhard Palitzsch was considered by many as the most efficient killer of the death wall. On the day they began such massacres against a group of Polish prisoners of war, he personally shot 151 people. He did it slowly and methodically, without any hurry, completely deaf to any pleas for mercy. After he finished walking through the rows of men he had just shot a moment before, he would backtrack, finishing off anyone who was still breathing. But as cruel as this massacre sounds, it was only one of the dozens that Palitzsch carried out. According to his own words, at the death wall he killed by himself 25,000 prisoners, always with a shot to the back of the head. This number seems an obvious exaggeration, but statements from both colleagues and other captives make it clear that, regardless of the actual number, the cruelty of this person cannot be denied. There exists a chilling testimony of how he murdered 2 parents and their 3 children, including a baby. He started by taking the youngest from his mother's arms, then shot him in front of her. He proceeded with another child while the parents, terrified or resigned to their unjust fate, could do nothing. When the last of the siblings resisted, Palitzsch threw him to the ground, placed his boot on him to keep him down, and shot him in the back of the neck. Only after all 3 were dead did he continue with the adults. This was just one of the crimes committed by Gerhard Palitzsch. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of others were forever forgotten, as their only witnesses died within the walls of Auschwitz. Although they had many executioners like him, the German authorities soon realized that killing prisoners by bullets was not an effective method of elimination. Since they sought to murder millions of people, shooting them all was not going to be effective. Thus, they began experimenting with new killing methods, with the first trials occurring in the aforementioned Sachsenhausen camp. This eventually led to Zyklon B. This product was a cyanide-based pesticide, which began to be used in the gas chambers of concentration camps in 1941. Gerhard Palitzsch was part of the initial trials with Zyklon B. The victims of the first experiment were nearly 1,000 Soviet and Polish prisoners who were locked in the basement of Block 11 in Auschwitz and gassed with the compound. The next day, Palitzsch entered and found that not everyone had died. Without a trace of compassion, he ordered more pesticide to be added to finish the job. A few hours later, there were no signs of life in the room. The product was quickly approved for mass use. Often, Palitzsch was part of the officers who chose who should go directly to the gas chambers upon their arrival at the camp.
When newly arrived Jews, along with other prisoners, arrived at Auschwitz, they were subjected to a selection process on the ramp. Nazi officials, including doctors such as Josef Mengele, would separate the arrivals into 2 groups, those fit for forced labor and those deemed unfit, often including the elderly, young children, pregnant women, and the sick or disabled. Those considered fit for labor were sent to the camp, where they would face grueling conditions and forced labor. Those deemed unfit, often including the elderly, young children, pregnant women, and the sick or disabled, were sent directly to the gas chambers for immediate execution.
For years, as the Nazi machine put its final solution into motion, Palitzsch was able to unleash his cruelty without any repercussions or reprimand. He was feared and hated by the prisoners, respected by his superiors, and admired by his colleagues, at least by those who shared his brutal personality. It was during this time that a certain willingness to mercilessly torture and kill minors began to emerge. Surviving prisoners spoke of how, on one occasion, he locked himself in a courtyard with a large number of girls. He forced them to run in circles, while he calmly and meticulously shot them, as if he were hunting rabbits. He also, more than once, tore a baby from its mother's arms and smashed its head against the wall. Always after these devastating acts, Palitzsch would light a cigarette and smile, while the blood of his latest victim covered his face. Surprisingly, Palitzsch's inhuman behavior was not reflected in his family life. He lived with his wife and children near the camp, where, according to employees who worked in his home, he displayed the personality of an ordinary father. The couple treated the servants with respect. They did not host parties, did not invite people over, and did not drink alcohol. Palitzsch was affectionate towards his wife, to whom he often brought gifts. And while in Auschwitz he might kill a smiling baby, he lovingly made his children tea and biscuits. This dual behavior was not uncommon among SS officers, many of whom led normal lives outside the camps. The gifts Palitzsch gave his wife came from Auschwitz. They consisted of possessions that prisoners had when they arrived at the camp, which had been confiscated and placed in the camp's storage rooms. Although the guards were forbidden to take these goods, which were to be used to finance the war, a very large number of them did so anyway. In general, they were looked upon in the dark and only asked to be cautious when doing so. But it was not long before the wives of the most prestigious SS officers were parading around in fur coats or jewelry that had belonged to Jewish women imprisoned at Auschwitz. These were the crimes, which seemed insignificant compared to the daily massacres of prisoners, that eventually led Palitzsch to experience the consequences of his actions. But we will talk more about this later. By 1943, the final solution had already murdered millions of people in the concentration camps scattered throughout Germany and the conquered nations. Auschwitz had witnessed, and would continue to witness until the end of the war, the largest number of victims of the Nazi ideology. Yet even so, they could not break the feelings of rebellion that brewed among some prisoners. They always sought ways to sabotage, slow down, or even attack Adolf Hitler's war machinery. Here is one such action that we can hear about next.
Tal fue la situación de desesperación e impotencia que ya en 1944, al enterarse un grupo de prisioneros de que iban a ser asesinados, se apresuraron a coger palos, piedras y armas caseras para provocar el único motín del que se tiene constancia en Auschwitz. Atacaron rápidamente a los guardias de las SS, prendieron fuego a un crematorio incapacitándolo temporalmente y finalmente intentaron escapar, pero fueron muy pocos los que lo consiguieron. La mayoría fueron capturados y ejecutados. Otros 250 murieron en el combate y los alemanes asesinaron a modo de represalia a otros 200 que nada habían tenido que ver con el motín. El resultado final no dejó lugar a dudas. No se tolerará el más mínimo intento de resistencia, pero por lo menos un grupo de personas demostraron que no estaban dispuestos a desvanecerse sin luchar.
One of the ways the prisoners devised to rebel against the Germans was to infect the clothing that guards stole with lice carrying typhus. Due to the appalling hygiene conditions in the concentration camps, epidemics of this disease were very common here. The prisoners aimed to thereby infect their oppressors as well. Palitzsch, unsuspecting, took home one of these garments to give to his wife as a gift. He escaped contracting typhus himself, but a few weeks later, after a brief but devastating fever, she died. Gerhard Palitzsch's fury was terrible. Shortly after his wife's death, he returned to the camp determined to punish the prisoners. It's unclear whether he suspected the disease was a result of the detainees' actions or simply took revenge on them. It didn't take long for his facade of calm and composure to begin to crack. In an act frowned upon even by SS members, he sexually assaulted one of the detained women. The Germans, who boasted of their chivalry even when killing, had no patience for such actions in detention centers. Worse yet, they believed that if a soldier raped someone deemed inferior, they were tarnishing their Aryan blood. This was called Rassenschande, or racial disgrace, and was illegal. Palitzsch quickly lost the respect of his superiors due to this transgression. Coupled with accusations of theft, it led to his expulsion from the SS. Not even this organization, responsible for thousands of killings throughout World War II, wanted him among their ranks. Initially sentenced to a long prison term, Germany could not afford to lose soldiers at this stage of the conflict. By mid-1944, German troops were being invaded by both Western allies from France and Soviets on the Eastern Front. Therefore, Palitzsch had his sentence commuted and was instead sent to a punishment battalion. In these units, criminals and convicts, both civilian and military, were assigned nearly suicidal missions. Clearing minefields, attacking fortified positions, or slowing down unbeatable enemy advances were among the operations they had to perform. They had an extremely low survival rate, and it was expected and accepted that most would die in combat. This was the fate that awaited Palitzsch. While his trail fades somewhat after his demotion, it is known he fell on the Eastern Front in late 1944. Historians argue it is very likely he died in the Battle of Budapest in December of that year. The city had been declared a fortress by Hitler, meaning it had to be defended to the last man. Outnumbered and without rescue options, nearly 100,000 Axis fighters perished there. All witnesses who survived the war describe Gerhard Palitzsch as devoid of humanity. Not only was he immune to the suffering of others, but he also enjoyed subjecting prisoners to humiliating torture before simply shooting them. Moreover, numerous testimonies attest to his tendency to murder children, a fact that cannot be ignored. Even his colleagues seemed to handle him with care. Rudolf Höss, commander of Auschwitz, wrote, "Palitzsch was the most cunning and elusive creature I have ever encountered and experienced in the numerous concentration camps. He literally walked over bodies to satisfy his hunger for power." Survivors of the camp describe him differently: the biggest bastard of Auschwitz. We've reached the end of the video and want to ask you, what do you think was Palitzsch's worst crime? Don't forget to leave your answer in the comments section, and you can subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.